Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending which part of the world you're coming from, and welcome to this webinar on Stop Phishing, Defend the Network. I'm Graham Melville. I'm a consultant and analyst in the security space, and I'll be moderating this webinar. With me, I have Oren Falzowitz, who is the Area 1 CEO and founder. He also worked at the National Security Agency. The lead analyst from GigaOm is Simon Gibson. Simon has been working in the security space for a number of years and has been a CISO at very large corporate financial organizations and also in the security vendor space. At the end of this webinar, we will be answering questions, and we'll also try and answer questions as we go along. So you'll see there's a chat window in the GoToWebinar panel. So please do put questions in there, and if we don't get to pick them up as we go along, we will answer them for you at the end. So information security continues to have a big impact on people's lives, both personally and corporately. Careers are ended because of breaches, companies' reputations are trashed, and intellectual property is leaked. But there's a balance between security and cost. It's kind of a bit like healthcare. It can become a bottomless pit. So where do you put your money? How do you assess the risk? The market continues to evolve, and as technology closes down attack vectors, the attackers move on to the next one. One attack vector, however, that seems to continue to be difficult to shut off is the human factor. Social engineering. Starting with social engineering, malware is introduced into organizations. Companies' secrets are willingly passed on, and huge amounts of money are transferred, never to be seen again. And all because a person is tricked into believing that a system or person they're communicating with is genuine, but it's not. For example, a company that I worked with recently had a new C-level exec join, and before he could get through the full process of joining and getting his first paycheck, it was discovered someone else had read up, worked who was joining the organization, and sent a targeted email to the finance department and had already very well taken his first paycheck. So with that, let's go on and move into the security challenge. Simon, why don't you take us through this first section?
Absolutely, Graham. Thanks. And Oren, thanks for being here and talking about phishing. So having been a CISO and been responsible for company security programs globally, I can absolutely say that that was our #1 vector into the company, into malware spreading. It was always, almost entirely always through some sort of email communication back and forth. And one of the things that we've seen, sort of for better or for worse, is that in the CISO space, the level of accountability and the sort of level of maturity around dollars being spent to attacks being prevented hasn't always connected the way it has with, for example, the CIO, which we've sort of seen 10 years ago was in a bit of the same state as the CISO, who's now kind of a lot more mature and there's a lot more accountability. So when it comes to how, we think about spending money and how I would think about making cases to my executives and to our board for my annual business planning, a lot of the times the technology we would put in would stop attacks once they get started. Once an attack drops, it would be a very reactive kind of security posture. And one of the things that I think we want to talk about today is that the perception versus reality around even the most advanced technology is still letting viruses and malware and rats drop and run on networks. And so how do you prevent that? That's really what Oren and I are here to talk about. Oren, what's your experience with that?
Yeah, well, thanks for being here with me, Simon. My experience is twofold on this front. When I worked at the National Security Agency, we used phishing extensively to do our work. And today, when we help companies prevent damages in cyberspace, we see that 9 in 10 incidents where there's some sort of intellectual property loss, financial fraud. Those all go back to the phishing problem. And I couldn't agree more about the accountability message that you were talking about. Cybersecurity, for the most part, is a technology problem, but it is also a leadership problem, and it does require some shared accountability across vendors, across teams and departments, and also from leadership. Where we often fail is when we don't see and take action against the things we understood or make them a priority. Oftentimes, making them a priority is through voting through dollars, but it's also recognizing the root cause of the problem, not chasing the endless shiny objects that pop up from day to day.
I mean, that's one of the things that we dealt with a lot, which was, from a leadership problem, I think everybody has this notion of what it feels like to be secure. And I think that's kind of where we got this perception versus reality, is that we all are experts in feeling secure. We all, no one can deny when you feel secure what you feel like. But the reality is that may not actually be secure. Lots of people write about things like security theater, and we hear all sorts of different, analogies. My favorite analogy is in the real world when, your car is stolen and you go outside, your car is gone. Like, it's been stolen. When your data is stolen, it's still there when you go and look for it. And also your data was stolen, it's left at the speed of light. And those are very different things from being an expert at feeling secure versus what it means to be secure in the cyber realm. And, what I think, and this has been a little bit of my experience, is that because we feel like it, we know what it feels like to be secure, even at a leadership level, we fancy ourselves a bit expert in it, but we also sort of push down this notion of training onto the end users. And we sort of, I think you said it last week, it was, we try to patch the users into fixing this. Talk to me about what happens there.
Well, sure. I think in recent times, as people become more aware of the problem, part of the way that we've made individuals and companies more aware is by heightening the threat and by talking about sort of the extravagant nature of you have a nation state problem, or you're losing billions of dollars. And it's every day that when you read about cybersecurity challenges, it's always the most extreme cases of that. And I think in the absence of really understanding what the problem is, not being able to focus on the root cause, such as phishing, people have looked for common sense solutions, and this sort of training and awareness idea has kind of come forward. It makes a lot of sense. It's sort of simple to do, but the reality is it doesn't have any practical impact. And I'll share with you a couple of metrics. The first is that organizations of any size that receive 10 messages have a 90% chance that one of those people is going to click on the messages. And so what we know is that for organizations that are 100 people, thousands of people, tens of thousands of people, it's almost an inevitability that someone is going to click. Even someone as experienced and who's seen as many different things as I have, we all work very quickly throughout our day. We're all trying to do our jobs correctly. And in 100% of the case, when someone does click, they're just trying to do their job and be productive. And yet, they can fall victim to these phishing campaigns. The second is that, after all of the training, the hundreds of millions of simulations, the thousands of lectures and so forth, the science in the subject shows that users only successfully identify 1 in 10 messages successfully as phishing. And so if you look for other analogies, you used the car analogy, Simon, a few minutes ago. Driver awareness it's an important thing. It's a requirement often to get your license, but it's the technologies within our cars, the airbags, the collapsible steering wheels, the sensors, the change lane sensors and so forth. Those are the things that save lives and have made traffic fatalities fall significantly. And the same is true if you look to epidemiological, challenges like the flu. It is a great idea to wash your hands come flu season, but ultimately the flu vaccine is the most effective. And we need to take a very similar approach in this space.
Right. I feel like that gets lost on people. Quick anecdote, we were talking about implementing a training program at Bloomberg when I was there, and we had the discussion about educating users that if a mail comes and it's got a component that's informative and it makes you feel a certain way, and then based on how you feel, it's got a directive that wants you to act, you're probably being phished. That's a combination of things. And then just as we kind of got that sentence out of our mouth, we looked at our employee population and realized that there were 3,000 people in the news division, and then we just described the reporter's job. So even if we trained the people, it's still not going to stop them from clicking it. And that was, at least for me, a few years ago, where that light came on, that, you know, it's good to have cyber hygiene, it's good to train people, but at the end of the day, it's got to be the technology. And you know, and specifically like phishing. So what percentage of attacks was phishing related? Like, if this front door is open, you don't need a back door. That was one of our conversations about that. Talk to me about that a little bit.
Well, the data, you know, from breaches that we know about and ones that go unreported is that 95% of cybersecurity incidents start with phishing. I often like to say to people, there's not really a word in the English language to describe phenomenon that are 95%. It's almost a certainty. You know, we use words like the majority or most of, but those really describe things in the sort of the 50+% range. I'm a big fan of the political commentary by the folks at 538, and one of the things that they've done recently is move to descriptions of likelihood such as 9 and 10. And so we often talk to people, rather than saying 95%, people have a hard time imagining, or they can focus on, well, what's the other 5%? Those must be the really bad things. You know, 9 and 10 incidents start with phishing. It's a greater percentage, but the reality is that almost all cybersecurity incidents can be linked back to phishing. I spoke with the CEO of the largest incident response firm earlier this year, and he told me of the 227 major global incident responses and data cleanups that they conducted in the prior year, 220 of them could be linked to phishing, and the other 7, they didn't have enough data to understand the root cause. And so there's no or few examples where, you know, phishing does not end up causing the financial or catastrophic damage that people worry about.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so if we say that it's almost a certainty that if there's going to be a breach, it's going to be through a phish, one of the, you know, the tenets that I've run my incident response teams and security operations centers behind was always the kill chain. And one of the tenets of the kill chain, and I'm going to not go into it because I assume most of our listeners are familiar, but one of the core tenets in the kill chain is stopping it earlier is better. The closer you can get to remediating the attack farther from the final goal of it, which is usually hands on keyboards exfil, the better off you are. Talk to me a little bit about getting to the phishes before they hit the mailboxes.
Well, sure, and I think we'll address some of this as we move forward. But you know, we use the term preemption at Area 1. It's the idea of taking action at a point and place and time where you can change the outcome. And what we see across all of the data and the insights that we've gleaned over the years is that almost 100% of phishing campaigns can actually be stopped before they land in the user's inbox, and that comes because of the way sophisticated and criminal hacking organizations work. They run like large assembly plants, and a lot of this is very intuitive. And we'll give some good examples as we go forward as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So let's go on and take a look at some examples then, and maybe take us through how these happen. So, Oren,
sure. So this is one of the things that we've observed at Area 1 is that there's a dialogue in the community about whether or not attackers are sophisticated and whether or not attacks are unprecedented. And we often see that language used in a post-breach scenario where vendors and customers are trying to explain why something got by. And so using the sophistication and the unprecedented nature of it sort of helps to get past the damage or the embarrassment. We believe that attacks are really very different, that they don't typically have any technical sophistication. What they do is they leverage authenticity and an imaginative component that hackers have to their advantage. And so very early on in our practice to stop phishing, you know, we started to use things like computer vision and artificial intelligence to catch websites kind of like what you see here, which are almost pixel perfect representations of legitimate websites, And the vast majority of phishing lures really take advantage of this. They present either as an executive, a boss, an authentic business relationship, or they present themselves as an authentic company, whereas the user is clicking, they see things that they recognize and they take advantage of that trust that's built in by the largest cloud providers. When you look at the 2016 election hacks, you see that people were foiled by thinking they were logging into Google, logging into Apple, to Amazon, to DocuSign, to financial services organizations like we have here. And so this versus any specific technical code advances is really what represents the vast majority of the initial phishing lures. As we go forward, just to a few more examples, you'll see more of that. But what we also see sometimes is that this idea that Simon was talking about, which is when I worked at the Pentagon, if you got an email from a general or a superior, if you work at a Fortune 500 company and the CEO, says, "Hey, I need you to call me, or I need you to do this," employees react, and we see the business email compromise versions of the Phish taking advantage of trusted relationships, the credential harvesting, like we showed in the prior example, but also with social media apps or logging into cloud-based inbox email providers like Microsoft's Office 365 or Google. This gives attackers a tremendous advantage every day, and tens of thousands of people continue to fall victim to that, but they're not unprecedented in their ability to be stopped.
I definitely think we should talk for a second about business account compromise. And I mean, again, FBI says this is a big number. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Oren?
Yeah, I mean, today, there's just been a tremendous amount of financial crime taking off on this version of phishing, where controllers, accountants, people are being asked by what they think is an executive to transfer data or transfer money. Sometimes these business email compromise, are multi-step. One of the things that's most pernicious in this front is we'll often see the business email compromise as a step 2 in the phishing, where the first phishing campaign gets the executive to actually hand over their username and password, and then the attacker is able to log into their account and actually mimic them and to do other forms of spoofing. And I think it just goes to what we've been speaking about previously, which is, users are just trying to respond and do their jobs. It's very hard to say to the CEO of the Walt Disney Company, if you work there, "I'm sorry, Mr. Iger, I thought your email looked a little funny, so I didn't write back to you." Very few of us, have that ability or wherewithal on that front.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I think the statistic that I looked at on FBI side as we were putting together our phishing landscape paper was about $150,000 per compromise. It's about the average amount of money that successful phishes are costing. I think Graham alluded to one earlier. I don't think the number was that high, but again, that's the average amount. So some are obviously going to be more.
Yeah, I think in this case, Simon, one of the things that I'm very sensitive to here is that sometimes the statistics, they veer to one side, that the damages are so great. I hear from hundreds of companies who will say, "Yeah, I got one of these and I wired $15,000 or $20,000. And it's important to understand, while some people kind of will sweep that under the rug or they'll write it off in their financial practice, when you look at the economics of being a bad guy, to wake up in the morning somewhere around the world to send a few emails and get $15,000 or $20,000, that's a really good day. And we have to do better to make it more expensive for them to work. And it's not just the hundreds of millions of dollars in business email compromise that matter. It's the totality of all of them, whether they're 10, 15, 150,000 or hundreds of millions. One of the largest banks in the world last year fell victim to this for $86 million. Facebook fell to a business email compromise financial attack for tens of millions of dollars. And so you just see the same technique at all levels is impacting everyone. And we often see that folks just a little bit under that Fortune 500 Global 2000 range, they don't really, they continue to get merged together, and it's sometimes easier to slide in, and it's a universal problem that everyone faces.
Yep.
Yeah, so it seems like phishing goes a lot of different ways. So we were talking about the financial impact at the end, but there's other things, the leaking of IP, people getting inside systems, malware. And it seems there are a lot of different techniques and options for security to stop it further down the kill chain. Now, obviously, most of these are reactive in nature, and when something bad happens, every vendor rushes in to say how they can fix it, and what you need to buy from them, which of course then leads to increasing security budgets. And it seems like that security defense is always on the back foot. What's kind of happening here? What's some of the issues that we face with the mirage of traditional security we have?
I think, Warren, why don't you take that one?
I mean, generically, the 99% of security solutions are reactive. They identify and respond to things after there's already been damage, and so that's a significant challenge. I think the second is more of a psychological industry problem where what we're trying to do is consistently speak to a variety of leadership levels, CEOs, security professionals, common individuals about this problem. And I think what folks have tried to do is subdivide the problem very greatly and to create a lot of new terminology that really represents the same thing. And so let me walk you through a couple of examples. So we know that 95% of breaches start with phishing, or 9 in 10 damages kind of go that way. And what we see is that there can be a ton of terms to describe the same thing. So we were just talking about business email compromise. It's a form of phishing. Sometimes we talk about credential harvesting, websites where users, get links in an email and then enter a username and password. Another form of phishing. Some of the latest industry reports, from the likes of Verizon or other leaders who study post breaches, and they'll say things like 91% of malware is delivered via email. Well, that's phishing, right? So there's not a uniform way that which people want to talk about this, and I think there's a variety of reasons for that. And it's so important that we take a step back and focus on the root cause, which is consistently that users, whether or not they get an email with a link, whether or not they get an email with an attachment, whether or not they get an email with nothing but it causes them to take action, whether or not they mistype something in the browser and enter a username or password, click on something on the World Wide Web. These are all attempts to get users and lures to get them to take actions unwittingly that will cause damage. Those are all phish. That's the problem that needs to be solved.
So this is a good question, and this maybe goes even up a little, up leveling a little to the sort of philosophical notions as to why do you suppose it is that we tend to put things in buckets? Because I know as a practitioner, when somebody asks me, especially an executive who's experienced, a smart person who's been involved in business for years, knows their business backwards and forwards, but maybe doesn't understand some of the technical things. My experience has been the more I get asked about a specific, why did this happen? How did it happen? What did it do? Okay, so now that I've told them, so what do you mean the malware dropped? Like, what does that mean? The more I get, I find myself going down into these really deep dives. I wonder, Warren, why do you think it is that we end up sort of putting these things into little buckets as opposed to sort of going backwards and explaining, look, it's just part of the whole problem?
I think there's two primary reasons. The first is, it wasn't too long ago, Simon, when I was working in the government and when this issue was getting greater attention in the public consciousness, that we needed to really impress upon people how serious it was. And so part of that need to get people to take action is a continuous effort to create fear, uncertainty, and doubt. I think that was very successful and important several years ago. It was important to get people to really understand what was going on and to do something. But the result of that is you can't continue to fear people into doing something. The second part of it is important to understand nuance. And because cybersecurity is a technical domain and the practitioners, for the most part, are very detail oriented, some of these nuances are important on some level to develop a variety of different techniques and approaches. But the same can be said for the common cold. I think there's something like 230 versions of the common cold, but you don't take individual pills for them. You up-level and say, hey, you have a cold, you take Tylenol, and we don't worry about in our solution space, subdividing it, and we just haven't gotten to that place universally in the security community.
Yep. Yep. I definitely, I think that makes a lot of sense. I know for sure that getting the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or at least communicating the severity of the problem was really important, because it didn't get it. And, you know, in my experience, I've run a lot of different security programs at different levels, doing different things. At the end of the day, they were all one security program, but, you know, there were different teams. There was an incident response team, there was an attack team, there was a product security team. There's been, you know, security operations team, developers writing software for it. And you know, in my experience, one of the most, you know, important lessons I've learned as a CISO over the years is to try not to look under every rock, because under every rock I can find a problem. Like if I open 1,000 employees' laptops, I'm going to find at least 1,000 problems, if not 10,000 problems or more. Because, you know, there's going to be a bunch of people that have put on, you know, they've installed some toolbar that's not necessarily supposed to be there, but they had credentials to, or somebody's down-revved a patch or two, or, you know, somebody has insecure permissions, or, you know, there's going to be problems if you look for them underneath all the rocks. The next one is, you know, and I think you kind of said it as well, which was, you know, it's very reactive. I know, again, from my experience as a CISO, when there would be a breach, we would dive into that, you know, that sort of, you know, there are, you know, many hundreds of variety of cold. So which pill should we take? Well, we should take the cold pill, but that in cybersecurity doesn't tend to be how it works. And I think I would actually contend that a lot of that has to do with leaderships and people who are, you know, used to sort of solving problems at a high level with maturity and backing it into budget, will very much say, look, I understand what it feels like to be secure. I understand this problem, go fix that one thing. And it becomes this very reactive thing rather than treating the whole problem. And you know, this is what we would say at Bloomberg. It's like, which knee do we jerk next? Like, this breach has just happened, or this person who, you know, had access to something they weren't supposed to, did something, you know, what are we going to do next? And it gets very exhausting as a CISO. And I think, you know, any CISOs on the call will probably understand that feeling. And then finally, you know, this other part of the conversation we had last week, I'm interested in your take on this one too, because as defenders, we understand asymmetry. We understand that we can defend against 1,000 things and the attacker just needs to get through one. But I think it's even more prevalent in phishing.
Yeah, well, you know, the cybersecurity doom narrative, Simon, it's become so embellished that we've almost lost our to take action. And, you know, really what's required is sort of an all-out optimistic assault, you know, on the problem. I think that too many people have become hypnotized by a cargo cult science of cybersecurity. And we're almost looking for this, you've got the picture of Neo here, but we're looking for this techno-autocratic nerd who can flip it and kind of save the internet by the strength of his or her own destiny or intellect. And the reality is that we as humans are really fantastic at solving hard problems. And there's no reason to believe that the seeming asymmetry is really not to our advantage. We give attackers, and I used to be one, way too much credit. And the reality is, in order to have the success that they're having at scale, they actually fall into a number of traps. The first one that we talked about was authenticity. You have to be authentic in order for users to be confused and to make mistakes. But it turns out that authenticity is actually one of the things that we're best at detecting through some of the new forms of computer vision and artificial intelligence. It's easier to spot lookalikes than it ever was before. And so, you know, we see that asymmetry actually as positive on our front. The second component of it is also that if you want to attack thousands of companies, or if you look at the statistics for what the damages are, where, you know, millions or hundreds of millions of dollars or damages are being assaulted, you can't hand stitch and craft every single attack like it's a specialized embroidered pillow that you would buy on Etsy. The reality is that the people operating these campaigns really run more like Ford Motor Factories, and those assembly lines have a lot of telltale signs that allow us to get in front of them And so we've sort of misplaced our focus on the Neos of the world versus the kind of the regular, Joe the plumber type hacking that it is.
Interesting. I know for at least, when I think about asymmetry and I think about, only one kind of having to get through, I think you're absolutely right. It is true. There is a bulk, there is a bulk method to some of the attacks. I think it is more recognizable. And I think that the other sort of positive side there is when you spot one, you spot kind of all. Like when you get the telltale sign or the TCP of a particular thing, you can solve broad swaths, which is, again, as a defender, what I really like to do. I like to be able to solve, large problems that's not like looking under every rock and fixing, everybody's version of Java and whatnot. But I will say, as a defender, I will say, as a defender, one of the problems that I've come into is, hang on, somebody, maybe me. One of the problems that I've run into has been when I wanted to defend a network, I've had to ask for permission. I've had to have a budget line item. I've had to have a GL. I've had to pick the vendor. I've had to maybe do an RFP selection. I've had to get a conference room booked. I've had to get sign off. I've had to get buy-in. I've had to manage by influence. And then I feel at the end of the day, 6 months later, I get to roll out a solution. When I get attacked, I feel like the attacker just opens his laptop and doesn't, stands up, gets some Linode sites and builds a web page that looks like Wells Fargo or Bank of America or Google, and then just starts sending email. And they don't need a conference room or permission. And as a defender, I always feel like I get my back up a little bit about that, that I feel like it's easier for the attacker.
So it certainly seems that way. And, we all see emails that are very clearly not authentic. Someone in Nigeria asking us to send some money so we can get the millions we've supposedly inherited. But others obviously are looking a lot more authentic. So it seems like there are different options out there. So what are the elements of a solution that matter? There's inline and out of band, there's on-prem, in the cloud. You can put stuff on the endpoint, you can detonate stuff, put it in sandboxes, there's domain protection, and we've already talked about, kind of the training and awareness. How does this all fit together? What are the elements of a solution and what's effective?
Yep. So I think, in terms of the cost of missing phishes, and it's that 1 in 1,000 needs to get through, or 1 in 10 needs to get through, and the likelihood that it'll succeed. The other one was at least my experience has been, well, don't these things already get shipped inside of O365? Doesn't, Google Apps already have something? Heck, doesn't even Yahoo have something to sort of weed out malware and links and phishing? Like in the traditional even gateway protection, like I'm interested, Oren, in sort of what your experience has been when you talk to people about what their expectations of large mailbox providers are.
Yeah, well, I just want to go back to something you were saying just a second ago, about the only takes one. Every day people reach out to us and they say, hey, here is a phish that we got at our company, and would you have caught it? And one of the interesting things about those questions is that there is a belief system on the person receiving the messages that they got something truly rare. And in almost 100% of the time, when we look at those examples, we've seen thousands of them at other customers and other spaces. But people want to internalize and think about the attacks as being very personal, but they're almost entirely not. The cloud inbox providers and the great shift to Microsoft's Office 365 and to Google's work email products have been really amazing. And what they've done primarily is they've provided some really best of breed anti-spam technologies and some great controls for people and really strong simplicity in terms of getting set up. But they've consistently not been able to solve what we estimate to be somewhere between 0.4 and 0.75% of messages that come to users that are targeted phish. People see that every single day. One of the unique opportunities of phishing, unlike most security challenges like a DDoS or like a dropper, as you were mentioning, is that you can actually see a phish and you can forward it to someone. You can get eyeballs on it. And we just see that users of all of these technologies continue to be phished on a daily basis. And that without sort of specialized attention to the problem and kind of new approaches, you need to have more layers that are effective.
Yeah, that's, as I was doing the research for our phishing landscape message protection paper, that was one of the things that came out really strongly, is that at a broad swath and protecting against malware and potentially embedded links and certain types of communications at scale they can find, but as it gets targeted, it becomes more and more difficult. This is probably a good opportunity to explain what pretexting is to the listeners, if they're not familiar. Do you want to talk a little bit about sort of pretexting and getting people to, again, it's that wiring money thing. There's nothing embedded in the email other than language that is used to weaponize an attack.
Yeah, absolutely. We see this all the time. There's a variety of flavors of it. It's just sort of, I just want to start the relationship, right, so to speak, virtually. And it's kind of innocuous. Hey, could you give me a call? Or and I'm going to send you something later today. And so it starts to create sort of a cognitive recognition that something is going on. We've even seen attackers go so far very recently at some very large Fortune 50 companies where between the company and between a trusted supplier, they're having a dialogue about business. And then in the middle, 10, 15 messages deep in the middle of the conversation, the attacker is able to switch the reply to domain and send new ACH instructions or new wire instructions back. And so, as a user, this is a totally unreasonable expectation that, as you're going back and forth with someone, you're going to be inspecting consistently what's going on. And we just see that as being very typical and key and something that's relatively straightforward to stop if you take the right approach.
And is this something that large gateway like email providers they're not going to? I mean, clearly detonation chambers and process isolation isn't going to fix this because there's no embedded link, there's no embedded attachment, there's no malware, there's nothing to unzip. But is this notion of an account that's been taken over something that large mailbox providers are going to catch?
What I would say is that typically not, certainly not today. There's a couple of reasons for it. The first is some of the attacks come from those providers themselves. So as we talked about the economics of being a bad guy, you can go sign up a new Google account today and you can start messaging into someone, and it's going to pass all of these authentication checks like SPF, DKIM, DMARC, and it's going to look like it's coming from a very legitimate IP, which is Google itself, email a company running on this platform, and they're just not having the ability to understand that it's malicious. Much of the world's email today is marketing, and one of the key sort of tricks in marketing is to surreptitiously spoof who's actually sending the message to make it look authentic. This has become a very common business practice. So, we don't want to stop those activities for commerce, but it does create sort of a conflict on this front. And then the second part is that a lot of these communications actually come once an organization or a partner through the digital supply chain has been breached, and so you're actually getting messages from a legitimate domain, and so getting in on those is something that hasn't been addressed today by the major cloud providers. But what they have done is they have really taken the spam off the table, and they started to provide more of the basic capabilities. That adds a lot of cost advantages for companies who have invested in very expansive anti-spam solutions in the past to really refocus their dollars towards the phishing problem, which is causing them the damage because they're not getting that kind of bulk unwanted messages, and they need to just focus on the targeted attacks.
Right. And so I think in this next slide, and honestly, I think like you said, as these mailbox providers are doing a better job of getting the spam caught and some of the low-level stuff, it drives up the cost for the attackers, and it makes them have to work harder to get through. Like I recently just set up a new email account, looked in my spam folder a couple days later, and immediately had an attack. Somebody created an envelope from my name at this company and said, you know, they'd hacked my account because it came from me, says the header, right? But when I actually, or says the envelope from, but when I actually look at the headers, clearly it didn't. You want to talk to us about some of I mean, I looked at the slide and I thought, wow, this is an expensive attack method. If you can carry this out in mass, it's probably pretty good though.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you know, as we were talking about, sometimes individuals, when they're looking at the individual attacks, they seem pretty unique. But the further back you go and the further unpeeling of the onion, what you see is that the cost for setting up thousands of like alias accounts to then go into the infrastructure and then to go to the victims, there's really this operational assembly line here. And so what we see is the further you work back, and what we're showing here is some information provided by the Justice Department in their indictment of a North Korean hacker. And what you can see from their graph is it plays out exactly like we know it to, and exactly like attacks work, which is you might feel like you're getting something very unique, but it's typically running off a stable set of infrastructure. That infrastructure was set up by an even smaller number of alias accounts, and going back further, you know, it's fewer and fewer. And so the more ability you have to reach out into the wild and to see how those attacks unfold, what you see is two things. One, it's a more limited set of root servers, you know, at the core. And the second is there is quite a bit of a time delay here. So, you know, to actually set all this up is relatively time consuming, but it means that some of those artifacts and some of those telltale signs are dangling out there for everyone to see. We estimate somewhere around 26 days before the messages ever get sent to the user. And so the preemption possibilities here are pretty significant and prove to work very effectively.
Interesting. So what are, so in terms of the way you think about it, what are some of the tactics you use, or that honestly, that just generally are helpful at detecting these kinds of things?
Yeah, so we think that, you know, the most effective kind of way, you know, to prevent cyber damage is to, one, focus on phishing. The second is to take a more preemptive approach to the problem, and that means being proactive, not waiting for messages to get into your inbox to inspect the links, the headers, and so forth, to do the IP reputation at that time, but to actually have technological mechanisms that are analyzing the totality of the web, looking for key infrastructure, identifying attacks, looking at the, you know, user impersonations, and that often is very revelatory, significant in significant time periods before those messages ever show up into the user's inbox. So I'll just give you a simple example. As we've been talking about, you know, it's true that if I wanted to send you an email today with a link in it, the process of sending that email is a relatively fast time problem, and it happens at network speed, as my old boss used to say. But what's untrue about that phenomenon is that the link, you know, within the email message has to point to a website, let's say, and that website has to exist before you can send the message. And so recognizing that that's part of the infrastructure to be set up, that's part of the brand impersonation that's happening out in the wild, identifying that actually gives you almost a month's advantage to stop the phishing campaign before the hit send button ever gets pressed. And so we just need to take the time advantage away from the attackers. It's actually in the defender's advantage, but we've been trapped from a telemetry perspective on just what it is we get within our network. And today we've been able to kind of move that forward and push it out.
Interesting.
So do you want to take us then through, you know, a real solution? Tell us how it works, what it does, what it's doing along the way, and how it interfaces and interacts with other systems as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think on the next slide, well, so in area one, what we think about is sort of three things, right? The first is how to be preemptive, right? How to take that time advantage back in our favor. The second is, as we've talked a lot about, phishing attacks are often thought about as email, but they, in the vast majority of the times today, have a web component. You're clicking on a link, you're visiting a website. So you need to be more comprehensive, and our data shows that a significant number of phishing attacks never come through the email as well. And the third is the accountability piece, which we'll get to at the end. And so, on the next slide, what I've provided here is just kind of a high-level architecture view of how we think about the problem. And so the first is, as I talked about, being preemptive. We've developed technology that analyzes every web page on the internet every single day, and it does so like a human. And the general philosophy as we were putting it together is, before our customers were to click on something, we wanted to have already visited that website, and we wanted to understand, based on all the variety of different browsers, regions, IPs that may be coming from, how does that website interact and feel detect if it's malicious. We find that just by being proactive and doing it at scale, which is a pretty significant computer science innovation on our part, that upwards of 70% of the phishing that we identify on a daily basis ends up being unique. And as I mentioned previously, it's about 26 days before users see the referring links and the artifacts actually in their inbox. Now, the challenge with sensing technologies, whether it's like a national technical mean or something like we've built here, is that sensors only see what they see at a given time. And while being proactive is very helpful on that front, and in real time we can use that to make protections, the second step to being really effective is to extrapolate from direct observations and to create vaccines or patterns. And so today, we've got over 4 petabytes of data coming from that sensing technology, by which if a domain like badguy.com is observed as malicious through a sensor, tomorrow if it changed to badguys or badgirl.com, the sensor would have had to observe it to know it. But by creating patterns around it and saying, well, these next 10 things are 99% the same, allows you to get ahead of being omniscient on that front. And so the combination of proactive, preemptive discovery versus very deep and sophisticated learning allows, across email, network, and web, a very effective approach. I would just add one small item around learning. When people often talk about machine learning or artificial intelligence, they tend to talk about it generically as sort of singular mathematical approaches. And in our experience has been that a good way to think about analytics is like a car. I'm going to use a car analogy here. So, the Formula One car is the world's greatest car ever, and very specialized scenarios on F1 tracks. It does top speeds, hairpin turns. It's amazing. But if you asked, if someone in your family asked you to go to the stores in your neighborhood and get the cheapest price of corn, that car is almost totally worthless. For most analytic problems, it's better to have 1,000 Ford Focuses, where you can go out and distribute the problem and look for thousands of indications as to what might the answer be. And so our approach is very similar on that front. You want to look for hundreds, if not thousands, of features and indicators within any given message to determine with accuracy whether it's malicious. If you can't determine that it's malicious with accuracy, it has a downward effect, which is you can't take action. And a lot of prior solutions have really struggled from this, whereas they can create a lot of alerts and they can call a lot of different things suspicious, but at the end of the day, that forces a lot of human intervention, a lot of missing. This was sort of made famous in kind of the Target example, where some of the technologies were saying, well, we alerted to it, and the people on the ground were saying it was like one of 1,000 alerts. And we've really pushed the limits here to make sure that when it's identified as malicious, it's very binary. It is or it isn't, and that allows you to take action, stop it at the right time, and that prevents damage.
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting tactics you guys have taken that I was impressed with too is your model, right? So you really put your money where your mouth is. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, then lastly, as I was saying, we focused on the preemptive and the comprehensive piece, but we've also focused on being accountable. And as I mentioned, cybersecurity requires a technology solution, but it also requires a lot of leadership, accountability, and investment in the right areas. And so, we've been very proud to be the only company in the space that's 100% performance-based, which means that If we don't catch it, right, there's no monetary exchange between us and our customers. We call that paper fish. And so our customers just pay us when we catch fish. And that has a number of great advantages. I think, Simon, you can speak to this as an executive. It allows you to really understand what your metrics are and to really say, hey, they caught 100 things and, we paid for those 100 protections. It allows people to make investments without hoping that we'll catch something. It avoids the art of the asterisk where you've invested a lot of dollars, but when it goes wrong, you're hearing back from people that it was unprecedented or sophisticated. And I think third, it aligns the teams really nicely that continuing to stay ahead and to catch the things that go undetected is how our business intends to be successful. And so it's a perfect alignment. Whereas you might have seen solutions fail in their efficacy over time, tying the business model to the performance for customers, I think is a long-term strategy for success and will result in better outcomes for the industry.
Yeah, I think that's important. There's all to the point we sort of brought up earlier of don't large mailbox providers because sort of have some of this built in. Well, what if I already have a secure email gateway? I think there's a lot to be said for a company that's willing to say, put me in front of it, put our technology in front of your existing, and I think we'll still show value. And as an executive and as a CISO especially, the cost of a phish getting through isn't necessarily just the damage it does in a pretexting, attack where somebody wires a paycheck or somebody, it is, at that point, when there's an event that happens on your network, it isn't just resolved when you identify it. You have to go scrub, everyone that touched the email. Who else got it? What other people were involved? Did you make a change to our financial systems? If you changed our financial systems, what did you change? Can you change it back? Can you take that ACH number out so that it never accidentally is used again? What were the controls around that? Do we have to reassess our controls now? And that's just one attack. If a machine is down, imagine a domain controller gets malware on it. Well, you have to rebuild that entire domain controller to make sure it gets back up if it's tainted. So the cost of the attack isn't necessarily just over in a point of time. It can have tremendous lingering results and problems. And so I think that being able to say, I've done and deployed phishing prevention, but we're still getting phished. I want another layer in front of it. Can we do this in a way that then makes sense on my balance sheet? It's really smart. I mean, that's definitely, as a CISO, it's almost like, honestly, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? Why would you not do that? What are your customers saying about that?
I've never encountered anyone who isn't getting phished or doesn't see them bypassing their existing controls. I think the question for people is, I think it's a good one, is how do I apply my resources correctly? And if you're able to isolate the unit economics down to the value that you're providing at the time you provide it, hopefully that gets people to take action quickly and to be more secure and gives them confidence that there is an outcome that's positive for them, and it doesn't have to be all that doom narrative that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and for sure, the ability to install, again, mail MTAs were set up to be pretty robust and easy to put in line and also quite fault tolerant. So, again, from a production impacting, a risk, there's very little to installing these kinds of things, which I think is another important thing to keep in mind. Again, huge vector, 96% of attacks come this way. The actual amount of risk to your network infrastructure pretty low when it comes to implementing these solutions.
Okay, so we got a number of questions that come in. So let's get onto those, because this seems to be what's people's top of mind. So one of them is about, migrating to a cloud service that includes email, that has email security with it. Do I really need other protections? And there's a couple of similar themes on other questions as well. I have a security vendor that bundles email security. So is there anything extra that's needed to what is added, given for free at the kind of the base level?
I think the answer is yes. We consistently see that the out-of-the-box cloud-in-box providers provide good baseline capabilities, primarily best-of-breed anti-spam and there's a good opportunity to reinvest those prior anti-spam dollars into phishing. But most of the major attacks over the last several years, you can look at what happened in the elections, are bypassing those cloud inbox providers, and with special focus that can be resolved.
Okay, and then a kind of question that links into those other questions is, can I add a solution such as yours into what I already have, or does it have to replace my current email security?
No, I mean that's part of the premise of why we moved towards the paper Phish, which is, if you've got existing layers but you want to close the gap on a per unit basis, they can easily layer in, and so that was really something we responded to from a number of our customers over the past years, which is, I already have investments in other places, and sometimes I'm just contractually obligated in those, or I'm making a cloud migration at some later time, but I don't want to live with this gap. And so you can get the confidence of getting to zero with the Phish, but doing it without upfront, making, very significant investments.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about email, but what about links that start elsewhere? So what about in social media, things such as LinkedIn or Twitter or Facebook? Is that, that's also social engineering. Is there any protection there?
Yeah, as I mentioned, our solution is to be comprehensive. We see, a large number of phishing campaigns not coming through email, but users just clicking on links. They either mistype them, they get them on social media, they get them through internal business communications like Slack or something to that effect. And our solution covers both email and the web, and that allows users to click with confidence. So if you get a link, on a mobile device, if you mistype something in your Chrome or Internet Explorer browser and it didn't originate through email, we've got layers built into our product that will make sure that you don't end up at those malicious destinations.
Right. Okay. Now, another question we have here, and maybe Simon, you can jump on this one. There are a couple of different ones that are talking around security awareness training, and there are organizations out there that will say, well, if you can stop your users from clicking it on the first place, then it doesn't become an issue. So, is there good enough security awareness training out there? Will that defend from phishing attacks?
Yeah, I think it's, as we discussed earlier, in my example of trying to teach reporters not to click phishing links, and sort of realizing that that's a lot of their job, is to get an email, make them feel a certain way, and then do something as a result in order to report the story. I think, I like the phrase, you can't patch the human. Like, there's just, a human is always going to do something if they believe and are convinced that it's legitimate. If this email is coming from your boss, you're always going to do it. Now, with that said, I do think that it doesn't hurt to train people. And honestly, even though humans aren't probably the best way to be, humans aren't meant to be, software, spotting, forensic devices. Humans are just meant to get their job done. They're not going to look at headers, and they're not going to look at embedded HTML. They shouldn't be. They should be working and doing their jobs. So, at the end of the day, it's the technology that we need to rely on to support the human being.
Yeah, I mean, just the facts are that people have been training for years. After lots of lost productivity, making users suspicious. After millions of simulations today, the facts are that users correctly only identify 1 in 10 fish as malicious properly. It's not going to get any better. It's not good for business. And no other examples, whether it's in washing your hands to prevent the flu, not texting while you drive, where a technology isn't really the thing that solves the damages that we want to prevent.
Yeah, and it's true. It is. Like, I have had experience where, by deploying an alias at my company, we had Fishbowl at my company, which was an alias. And we also had a button built in where if you thought something was a fish, you could report it. And honestly, there have been times where we've had a user spot a campaign before our sensors did. again, albeit 8 years ago. So it is helpful, but it shouldn't be your main defense. Just like washing your hands can prevent the flu. If you sneeze on your hands, go wash them. And I think that's just good sanitary practice. It's not your main line of defense, but it might stop you from infecting, whoever's hand you shake next. So I think it's worthwhile, but it shouldn't be your main line.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of detail here. We've talked about a lot of different solutions. One of the questions that someone has here is where can they go to get additional information, and what the different vendors do out there. So before I ask each of you to kind of wrap up, maybe Simon, you can just quickly answer that one.
Yeah, so we have finished a GigaOm report about phishing. It should be published later this week, and it's on gigaom.com/reports. And it's a pretty detailed landscape virtually about what we talked about, and the different solutions and approaches, and sort of the history of phishing and pretexting, and some stats from FBI about account takeovers and those kinds of things. So definitely go grab that at the GigaOm site. Lauren?
You just go to area1.com and got a lot of information about phishing and about how to take advantage of our performance-based approach to paper Phish. And please feel free to reach out to me directly if you have any questions.
Okay, so if you have to make one last takeaway for them, Aaron, you go first. What's your final takeaway?
9 in 10 damages in cybersecurity start with phishing, and it's important for executives and teams to be able to get alignment on their resource spend, and we're solving both of those problems.
Yeah, okay. I'm with Lauren on that. I would agree. It's stop things early in the kill chain is better. Your likelihood of an attack succeeding is greatly attackers being stopped. The earlier you can thwart them in the kill chain. If the message doesn't arrive in the inbox, there's virtually no way that's going to happen. So get to it early.
Okay. Well, thanks, guys. We are at top of the hour, so we need to close now. So thank you to all the audience for taking time to come in and listen. We trust this has been useful to you, and that you'll be back to hear more, and that you'll go to the various websites and pointers that we've given you to find out more. And feel free to send in additional questions that you may have to GigaOm, and we'll be happy to answer those offline. So thank you, and good morning, good evening, and good night.